correspondent is Barry Lynn, who runs the Markets, Enterprise and Resiliency Initiative at the New America Foundation. Barry.
Well, thank you, John, and I also want to thank Rob Johnson for organizing this really quite impressive event. You know, the challenge of the commentator is made somewhat difficult by having such a wide-ranging discussion. And it's actually made somewhat more difficult yet when the presenters don't share their presentations with the commentator ahead of time, the one exception being Andy. So given that fact, one of the things I did is I decided instead to critique the frame of the panel itself, and to do so by discussing a cross-border flow that's been much in the news recently, but very poorly understood, which is the flow of industrial components. 4 weeks ago, the quake off the coast of Japan caused the worst physical disruption of the industrial production system in the West since the Second World War. Consider just one company, Toyota. In Japan, Toyota is shut down essentially until at least May 10th. We don't know if it's going to start after that, but that's a 2-month shutdown of the biggest company in the country. In the United States, Toyota is probably going to be shutting down all of its production within the next couple of weeks. We don't know how long, they're not sure. They still have no idea how great the disruptions are. And this is just one company. Around the world, we have seen numerous small-scale similar shutdowns, some of which are still spreading 1 month later. What we have seen, in other words, is an industrial crash, a cascading domino-style shutting down of a system. This is a very new phenomena. We've seen a couple of industrial crashes previously. We saw one in 1999 after a quake in Taiwan disrupted the flow of semiconductors out of Hsinchu. We saw one in 2001 after the attack in September 11th. We saw one in 2007 after another earthquake in Japan. In every case, the ultimate cause of the crash was pretty much the same. It was extreme concentration of control over some keystone component. Just consider some of the things we learned about from this Japan quake. We've learned that one company controls 60% of the key semiconductor resin and produces that in one place. Another company, 60% of the sensor used to control the airflow in automobile engines. Another company, 90% of the copper foil used in lithium batteries. Another company, 50% of microprocessors used to control transmissions and brakes. And if you look at Japan as a whole, you usually find that 100% of those components come from Japan. This fact also means that it's not hard to envision far worse disruptions. It could be in Japan. We actually got lucky that this event took place in northern Japan as opposed to southern Japan. It could, if something happened in Taiwan again, there's been no change in the 12 years since the first industrial crash. The concentration of capacity there remains the same. Korea, we see the same sort of concentration as in Japan. China, I'm just going to give you a couple of numbers here, and we're talking, when you're dealing with China, you're talking about hundreds of cases in which you see extreme concentration of the capacity that we rely on in this country. 90% of the components that go into our drugs in this country come out of Japan. 100% of the chemical that we use to preserve food on our store shelves, 100% of ascorbic acid comes out of Japan. Now, many events can trigger a crash, an industrial crash, in addition to a natural disaster. I mean, we could see an epidemic, avian flu, it could be a financial panic, it could be conflict among nations, it could be a conflict within a nation. It could even be an attempt to sort of use this kind of interdependency to coerce another nation politically. The classic case was the Suez Crisis in 1956. We just saw that last September, when China cut off the flow of rare earths to Japan. Dahlia's right. Day to day, these systems have created somewhat more flexibility. The problem is when there is a great and sudden shock. The supply chain actually increases the peril immensely. From the point of view of society, it would seem to be absolutely unacceptable to continue to rely on these sorts of systems to transmit products across borders. So what has caused this extreme and dangerous concentration? Last evening, Harold James said that those images of tsunami, that makes him fear some kind of a reaction against globalization. Globalization did, in fact, contribute to the problem. In the old days, 20 years ago, industrial production around the world was doubly compartmentalized within largely self-sufficient nation states and within largely self-sufficient industrial corporations. When something went wrong, that event was very highly localized. But globalization broke open the compartment of the nation state. Outsourcing broke open the compartment of the 20th century firm. And the result is we now live in a world in which when something goes wrong on the other side of the world, neither of those old walls protect us. I'm going to make a statement here, however. And that's, I don't have the time to really buttress this statement with an argument, but it's a statement that's based on 10 years of close study of industrial crashes and 25 years of close study of industrial organization. Globalization is not the problem. Outsourcing is not the problem. Just-in-time processes are not the problem. None of these factors force people to concentrate capacity. On the contrary, in theory, all three should make it easier to distribute capacity. The problem is, or rather the missing factor, is that a generation ago, our anti-monopoly laws were essentially overthrown. For most of the modern era in the United States, antitrust laws taken together were the dominant factor in structuring the industrial activity in the nation. In making and protecting the markets for our industrial goods, it determined how people organized their supply lines. Internationally, we did not, of course, have antitrust. What we did have was a state that was willing to use its power aggressively to prevent other states from concentrating control over key sources of supply. The classic instance was 1986 or 1987 when the Japanese tried to grab hold of the components within the computer. The United States imposed quotas, it imposed tariffs, and it set up subsidies. The goal was not to bring that capacity home, it was to distribute it more widely. Taiwan was a beneficiary of that act, Korea was a beneficiary. Yet in 1981, the Reagan administration overthrew our antitrust law. In 1994, the Clinton administration essentially dismantled the intellectual and institutional apparatuses that we had used to oppose efforts by foreign states to concentrate capacity. Now, one result of these changes in law was political. In America, over the last generation, we have witnessed the greatest concentration of power, the greatest enclosure of marketplaces that we've seen in a century. If anything, consolidation today is worse than it was during the age of Rockefeller and Morgan. Then citizens faced only dominion over our heavy industry and transport and banking. Today we face also dominion over our retail, our farming, our services, our information. The other result of those actions was extreme concentration of capacity, hence of physical risk. This may have been an unintended byproduct, but one of the byproducts of that effort to overthrow the political economic regime put into place in the Second New Deal to distribute wealth, to distribute power, to distribute voice, and to distribute capacity. One of the unintended results of that is massive physical risk in the system. I'm actually going to have to avoid making many more comments on my fellow presentations, but thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Barry.